Course. Thanks for coming on. So let's get started. You reported on the latest news from Ukraine, which is that the Communist Party of Ukraine has been officially banned.
Yeah.
A court made the ruling. Was this yesterday that the ruling came down?
The final ruling came about yesterday. This was the Eighth Appeal Court in Lviv, and it ruled that the Communist Party and all its activities were to be banned, and importantly, all of its assets, so its funding, its buildings, everything that it owns, all of its assets across the country are being turned over to the state. So essentially, the state has shut the party down and seized all its assets. Now, in effect, the party was already banned. So, its activities had already been banned, and it had faced closure. But there've been a number of appeals. Now, this has been going on for a very long time. This isn't something new. But the party, let's not forget, it was the Communist Party of Ukraine was a mass party, and it had representatives in the Ukrainian Rada, the Ukrainian Parliament, and in the last election it stood in back in 2012, it scored 2.5 million votes, so something like 13.5% of the vote. Back in, I think it's at its peak, it was 6.5 million votes. So the problems really started for the Communist Party of Ukraine in 2014 and the Maidan coup. And ironically, the party actually voted for the impeachment of Yanukovych, but they were then subjected to, initially there were attempts to ban it under the pretext that it supported what they call separatists in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, and they were charged, and there was court proceedings initiated along those lines. And then in 2015, if you'll remember, the decommunization law came in, which banned the use of communist symbols and imagery, and the party was not allowed to use its own its own party logo. It had to change that in order to continue running. But that was again subject to numerous appeals. So this has been battling through the courts for a very, very long time. Of course, the General Secretary, Petro Simonenko, was banned from standing in elections. And well, he could do so, but not under the party banner and under the party name. The Communist Party's newspaper was also banned. And here we are now in 2022, and just days in fact, after the European Union voted in favour of giving Ukraine candidate membership status, to great fanfare. We saw the European Union flag in the Rada, in the Parliament, this mass euphoria, and this kind of congratulatory position adopted by most. Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, was saying, well, Ukraine supports European values. And of course, what's happening in Ukraine at the moment is deemed to be a fight for European values. And of course, those European values were reflected in the ban of the Communist Party. Now, there are people that will argue about that and say, well, it's not very, in line with the European Union. But of course, it is perfectly in line with the European Union. Back in 2019, and they'd already voted on a similar motion previously, but this one in 2019 extended it even further, where this motion, which was a grotesque falsification of history, that very explicitly said that communism and Nazism were two sides of the same coin. They were both, they were both evil ideologies, and of course they said that that street names and statues commemorating either of these ideologies should be torn down. Now, they were very careful, actually. If you're a geek like me and you read over the text of these motions and you listen to the debates, you'll see they were very careful, and they talked about Nazism and not fascism. And there's a very good reason for that, because then the fascist parties can say, well, it doesn't apply to us. And you'll see the situation in Ukraine. The banning of the Communist Party is just the latest in the banning of opposition parties. I think something like 14 parties now have been banned. On May the 14th, Zelensky announced this presidential decree where he banned, I think, 11 parties he banned then, including the opposition Platform for Life, which is the biggest opposition party in Ukraine. So, when people talk about democracy and the democratic values that they're fighting for, they never seem to mention the the oppression of, because they're all left-wing political parties. None of the far-right parties, none of the neo-Nazi parties have been affected by this ban. It's the left-wing parties, it's the communist parties, and we're seeing it's not just the parties. I think a report came out today saying that there's nearly 3,000 people that are under investigation from the intelligence services for high treason. Hopefully in a bit we'll talk about the trial of the Kononovich brothers as well, the two Ukrainian youth communist leaders who are currently on trial. Their trial opened last week. We were very fearful actually when they were detained on March the 3rd that they had been executed. Now, this is all of this news. This is shocking stuff, but it's passing by the mainstream media, certainly in Britain. It's not being reported, only by newspapers like the Morning Star. I'm guessing it's a similar situation in the United States too. And all of these people that proclaim to support freedom and democracy, even the what I term the faux left in Britain. These people that have loyally fallen in line with, behind the government, behind NATO, and they claim to be supporting progressive forces inside Ukraine, haven't said a word about the Kononovich brothers. They haven't said a word about the banning of the Communist Party of Ukraine or any of the other political organizations. They've remained abjectly silent.
Well, maybe you could, let's get into the Kononovich brothers then, if you could, but I want to, maybe if you could talk about in the context of this ban, the Communist Party of Ukraine, because what I've noticed, and this has been a months-long trend now in Ukraine, that doesn't get any coverage because Ukraine must be painted by the West, by the United States, by the UK, by the European imperialists, the US imperialists, as this country under siege that has absolutely no flaws, no accountability. It is just a victim of Russian aggression. So that has to be the worldwide outlook, at least the message that's sent. But I think there's a stark contrast between who is getting banned, which parties are getting banned, and the ones that aren't in Ukraine, right? You have, and dare I say, you said the difference between Nazism and fascism. I think that's a good way of putting this too, because a lot of far-right party, nationalist parties, you have the Azov regiment, which is in the National Guard of Ukraine, and the Western media said, "Oh, they're not Nazis. They're were neo-Nazis politically once, and now they're just nationalists inside the army now, and they aren't that many. There's only 800, but yet you see them in all of the Western media photos coming out of Ukraine." But there's a huge contrast here. They're not getting banned, despite the fact that they're overtly political with a political objective to run things. They want to run things in Ukraine, and so could you talk about this in the context of the Kononovich brothers, because it seems like only one side here is getting punished. You don't get any Western media coverage of it either.
I mean, you've hit the nail on the head, I think, pretty much, and. Throughout the Western media, there has been what I think is a very dangerous, downplaying the importance and the influence of the far right and neo-Nazis inside Ukraine. And as you said, Azov have been integrated to it, in the Ukrainian armed forces. But now we're seeing what you see now is, of course. They have two things, and they've been given by Western governments and Western media. That's credibility. They've been portrayed as fantastic fighters. Zelensky even brought them into the Greek Parliament, and as a fighter of all places. Given what they've gone through with Golden Dawn and the fascist rule in Greece as well, but they've also been given. Arms, they've been armed to the teeth by the West. So the question for me is, of course, once the conflict is over, which it will have to end at some point, what happens to all of those arms that have been flooded into the country and found their way into the arms of the you have a heavily armed fascist paramilitary force that will create, continue to wreak havoc. Now, the Kononovich brothers are two communist youth leaders, and they were detained on March the 3rd. And they have been, initially we didn't know what was happening to them. They were only pictured for the first time since then, last month. They were pictured handcuffed in the presence of a lawyer. And we know that the intelligence services, the SBU, which I'll talk about them a little bit later in my personal experience with them too. But we know that they had threatened them and said that unless you accept the charges against you, you're going to spend, and which will come with a 10-year prison sentence, then you'll spend the rest of your life behind bars. Now, it is alleged that they've been tortured, and I think that's incredibly likely given the history of this particular intelligence service. And they've been charged with disrupting the state, spying for Russia and Belarus. I mean, it's worth stating that they're ethnic Belarusians as well. And recently this week, the trial opened on last Thursday and Friday. They're banned from attending the courtroom themselves. The prosecutors told the lawyer that there wasn't going to be a hearing, so the lawyer left. And as soon as the lawyer left, the judge opened proceedings. So this is really, this is like Zelensky's show trial. And the brothers have, they appealed. They put an appeal out last week, and they appealed for members of the European Parliament, for elected politicians, and for the Western media to attend that court hearing, just so that they could see exactly what the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian government is all about. Now, the charges against them are that emerged on Monday were that they were planning to take over one of the districts of Ukraine. And the intelligence services didn't say which district it was. They didn't say when it was. And in way of evidence, they produced very little apart from some social media posts and some speeches that the brothers had given. Now, they have, they're anti-fascists. They've organised anti-fascist resistance in Ukraine. They've been attacked, on the street because of this. And, they have called for a peaceful resolution to the conflict in the Donbass and respect for the Minsk Accords. So, this is what happens to anybody that that doesn't toe the Kiev government's line. So this really is, this really is a show trial. There's many others, by the way, that have also been subjected to these kind of processes. I was in Ukraine in April, and I met many people who told me of similar tales of their neighbors, people fearing the knock on the door in the night and being taken away. And people were talking about a notorious torture dungeon in Mariupol called the Library, which is where people were taken and held in dungeons there, and they were subjected to horrific torture. Many of them disappeared, never to come back. Now, for people that might not know, there's been the establishment of a number of things. There's a hotline for people to call to essentially snitch on their neighbors and report people that have pro-Russian or alleged pro-Russian views. Now, that can mean anything, in Ukraine, and it just takes the slightest hint of suspicion, and the authorities will come and take them away. So these are not just leftists and trade unionists, but just ordinary people who are, supportive of their right to, to speak Russian. That's all it is. I mean, it's as simple as that. Now, I didn't last very long inside Ukraine. I was in Lviv. They threatened to execute me, and they told me that I was a spy. Now, I'm a bona fide journalist, whether they like it or don't like it. I'm the international editor of a daily newspaper in Britain, and I went in there to kind of get to the truth about what's happening, because we were seeing from the Western media in particular, BBC, ITV, Channel 4, The Telegraph, The Times, The Independent in Britain, NBC, CNN in the New York Times in the United States. All of them are deeply embedded with the Ukrainian government. They're based largely in Lviv and Kiev, but they're producing identikit reports that are just repeating the same the same stories over and over again, and they don't deviate from what is the government line, what is the NATO line, and the US and British government line. So there's no, the truth is very hard to get to the truth. But those that are, like myself, Eva Bartlett, who you'll probably know, and your viewers will know, she's on a government kill list because of her reporting from the Donbass region and eastern Ukraine. And hers, I think, for me, certainly, that her reporting from that region is exemplary, and I think it's some of the best at getting anywhere near the truth about what's happening in that region. I met many people that were telling me similar stories, that were saying that that they were threatened. Ukrainian Azov battalion soldiers had destroyed their homes. One woman showed me that her apartment block destroyed, and she said this was the neo-Nazis, this was Azov, she said. But she also told me that she couldn't leave. If you remember, there were these tales of Mariupol being held under siege. Now, the siege, yes, it was held under siege, but it's not who people think it was held under siege by. It was, they were very clear, and it was, there were, I lost count of the amount of people from the east that told me that it was the Ukrainian forces that held them under siege, held them hostage, and threatened to shoot them if they were leaving. So there's a real effort to contain the truth. In Britain, the Daily Mirror, I believe today, ran a picture on its I don't know if it was on its front page, but certainly somewhere in the newspaper, where it had shown a picture of an attack in the Donbass and in Donetsk, and claimed it was Russia that did it. Now, it isn't. This is misreporting. This was a Ukrainian shelling. If you probably aware of the news, but a 10-year-old girl was killed. I mean, the video footage is absolutely horrific. Her grandfather said that she was sliced in three. I mean, it's absolutely horrific. These are war crimes, but the war crimes that everybody's talking about, they just want to pin on Russian forces without any investigation. So, you look at the Kremenchuk, for example, the shopping mall that was. Right. I've written something about about this because there was the instant recoiling in horror at a shopping mall being attacked, and I understand that from ordinary people in the West and in Britain, of course. But that's the point, that's the point. Right. That it's used to cause that shock value at a time when there's this war weariness, and people are tired of the war in Ukraine. The public support for whatever's happening is waning. So, and this happened, of course, on the eve of the NATO summit as well. I mean, the timing, you have to question the timing, but then again, there's no kind of journalistic investigation into what happened. Now, we know that the photographs show that where were the cars in the car park? There's supposed to be 1,000 people inside, 18 casualties. You would expect like a slew of of videos on people taken on mobile phones, posted on social media, showing people fleeing and all this kind of thing. Yeah. Those things weren't, they didn't happen. But what we do know is that there was a warehouse that was storing weapons that was just behind the shopping mall, and this was somewhere that close to a train station so that they can move weapons around the country. I know this is happening. I've seen it with my own eyes. The weapons. I've seen the weapons and the military force and the soldiers entering the country on civilian transport networks. That was one of the things that I saw when I went into Lviv. So we know these kind of things are happening. So there's a very clear effort to shut down all opposition. So the Kononovich brothers, of course, are people that are speaking out. They're opposing the government, and it's their constitutional right to do so. It's enshrined in Ukraine's constitution that you're able to criticize the government. Now, there's people will say, well, we're under martial law, so that means we need to close down every TV station, every newspaper, and shut down all opposition parties. Okay, right. Well, let's look at that, because the majority of these party closures and the majority of the closures of media organizations started way before February the 24th, which is when Western liberals seem to think that what the situation started then. Yeah, they don't. They've been silent since. They were not saying anything in 2014, apart from cheering on the Maidan coup and